I'll just give everyone a few minutes to jump on. Hey, gang. Hope you're all doing well today. This Monday session. I think this is the first Monday session I've hosted for you, at least. So let's see how it goes. I think we have very little admin to announce today, so I'll just give another couple of minutes for people to join and then hand over to Fred. I think the key differences, and Fred can kind of mention this in his intro as well, is for today's session is that you can kind of contribute through the chat and you can contribute through the Q&A session. But also if you do want to kind of jump in and ask questions and kind of actually speak during the session, I think we're going to set it up so that you can do that and so that you can join and actually talk and present. So just be aware of that. If you've got any questions, go for it. It's going to be quite an interactive one this afternoon. Yeah. Hi, OT. I'm assuming OT is Oliver. Hi, Oliver as well. Okay, I'm going to give you, it's been 5 minutes, so I guess a couple of people are just running late. Let's give them a couple of minutes, but we'll probably just jump in. Yeah, like I said, not many, not a huge amount of admin today, just as usual. Recordings from last week should now be up, so if you want to catch up, go and check those on Notion. With slides, as mentioned, there are, if you can't access the slides, let me know, but in some cases it might be because we are unable to share slides from the session. Sometimes it kind of depends on the fund and what's been covered. But where they are shareable, they should be up and you should have access to them. Any other recordings, as usual, wait till the end of the week. They'll all be uploaded at the end of the week. Few of you have been connected with mentors and we need to kind of rearrange a few things around mentors, but we're working on that behind the scenes. Apologies if there's been any confusion there. And I think that's it. Like I said, this is going to be a kind of more interactive session today. So please do be ready to jump in. You're on Q&A or kind of raise your hand if you want to be able to jump in and speak out loud, and we'll be able to make you give you access to talk during the session. But without further ado, it's my real pleasure, very excited to be introducing Fred, who's going to be talking to us about building a board. And Fred, I'll let you introduce yourself. You'll do a much better job than I will.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. So my name is Fred Destin. I'm the founder of a fund based out of London called Stride.vc. And I've actually been in venture for 20 years. And the reason for that is I absolutely love it. It's my passion, it's my craft, it's my hobby, and I think done well, it's wonderful. So I still have a lot of passion and energy for what I do. And I would say out of all the jobs that VC involves, which is raising funds, sourcing, investing, etc., my favorite part is really being in the room with founders. And I think to a certain extent, everything for me is an excuse to get in the room with founders. And I think there's fundamentally, it's because I think the act of company creation is something that's, in the act of creation for humans in general, something quite foundational. And to be able to participate in that alongside founders is something that gives me a lot of lot of joy, and that's really why I do it. So yes, we're in the finance business, but for me, we're also in the creation business, and I truly enjoy that. And it took me a while to understand it, but I would say that I've been happy doing this for 20 years. I'll probably be happy doing it for the next 20 years because I'm just not getting bored. I've been fortunate enough to work with a bunch of talented founders. People like so Alex Chesterman and Zoopla and Kazoo from seed, in both cases from seed to IPO, since both of his companies have IPO'd now. Deliveroo when there are 20 people, Secret Escapes in the travel space when there are 5 people, a phenomenal company that I love dearly called PillPack, which has become Amazon Health from when there were 5 people all the way to the exit to Amazon. So a variety of companies, a lot of them in the consumer space. And throughout the many years that I've been active doing this, I've had my fair share of absolutely awful boards, as well as some high functioning boards, and I've been able to see the difference between the two. So our topic for today is really, we're going to talk about boards, but de facto we're going to talk about the role of the venture capitalist, the positive role of the venture capitalist, and the relationship with the founder fundamentally. And that expresses itself through the life of the company and the board, but it's sort of a code name for saying how do you interact effectively with founders and build high performance organizations starting at the top, so at the board level. So that's our topic for today. I really don't want to be doing a 1-hour monologue. So what I suggest is you can use the chat, you can use the Q&A, but I would also say, please raise your hand and I will absolutely call people out to come and ask their questions in their own words. I think it's more interesting and more interactive, so we can have some actual live conversations and ask me the difficult topics. So let me just start with a little preamble. I'm going to try to the extent possible to do this slide free. But again, it's only going to work. I'll switch to slides if I don't get any questions. It's going to be a bit dry. But I'd love to just get into conversations. So please don't be shy and ask questions as we go along. So there is, if we talk about the board, first of all, I think part of the reason why there's tension and confusion in the role of the board in startups is that startups evolve from being highly fragile organisms whose primary objective is to make decisions very quickly into sort of larger beasts that actually deserve governance and the classic things that you would expect and apply to and from a board. But very often, our role as investors and the role of the board vis-a-vis a team of founders evolves fairly dramatically over the life of a company. And I think it's kind of understanding the context is one of the keys. So maybe to start at the basics, just worth reminding ourselves for a second of what a board's supposed to do. So at the end of the day, the board as a governance organism is supposed to represent all the stakeholders, if I can use that ugly word. So that would be management, the employees, the customers, the market at large and society, and then of course the shareholders. And in theory, the role of the board is really to look at the impact the company has on all these constituents and act responsibly in the interest of all the constituents. Now, some of these constituents have heavier weight, typically the customers, because otherwise you don't have a business, typically the investors, because they have effective power in a number of areas, and of course the employees of the company, because if you don't have employees, you don't have a company at all. But theoretically, you'll look holistically at all of that. And the board ultimately, if you think about it from a governance standpoint, the board has ultimate responsibility for the direction of the company, so its overall strategy, who runs it, whether it shuts down if it runs out of money, whether it's allowed to raise financing if it needs financing, and whether it gets acquired or goes public. So in a way, when you boil it down, the key decisions that have to do with the life of the business over time always end up at the board and are subject to board decisions, which is why that body in itself has quite a lot of power. On top of that, in startups, you're going to have some explicit some explicit powers that the board has, such as, for example, approving the hire, an expensive hire. Typically above certain salary thresholds, you need to go back to the board, and the same for capital expenditure and stuff like that. So you can see that from a formal standpoint, the board has both a lot of power and a lot of governance responsibilities. Now, that's the theory, and that's what conceptually the board's supposed to do. What's interesting for us as venture capitalists is to think about what really matters and what has impact. And to do that, you need to put yourselves in the shoes of the founder of a company and just say, well, all that theory that I'm being taught in business school or that I could read in books about the role of the board is fine. But what does a founder, what does a company, a startup CEO fundamentally do? Well, the fundamental thing that they have to do, that he or she has to do, is make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. If you boil it down, so the role of the CEO is to define and set the vision, to help the company, its employees, etc., define focus and priorities, to constantly repeat that vision so customers, the market, investors, the employees are aware of it, and then primarily to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So, and when I say conditions of uncertainty, when you're a startup founder, you really have either no data, limited data, imperfect data, non-predictive data, but it's awful because it's a decision-making environment where you just don't know whether you're making the decisions half the time. And in fact, I remember talking to Errol Damelin, who's been the CEO of multiple companies, and Errol told me the following, which I thought was quite profound. He said, well, first of all, only the hard decisions make it to the desk of the CEO. So in other words, if the decisions are easy and you've built your company up the right way, all the easy decisions have been taken for you. So only the hard decisions make it to your desk. And secondly, you get roughly half of them wrong. So in other words, if you get a batting average around the decision-making that's well over 50%, you're doing extremely well. So you can imagine, if you put yourself in the shoes of the founder, that this constantly having to make decisions with everybody looking at you for their livelihood, the survival of the company, the success of the company, is a pretty lonely place to be. And so what happens in venture capital and in private companies is, because the board has so much power and influence, and it's effective power and influence, very often the board forum ends up being an incredibly anxiety creating place for a founder, because it can typically be a place where they get measured, they get found to be wanted, because startups are always chaotic and a mess anyway, they get judged, and sometimes they get fired, right? So the average experience of a founder vis-a-vis their board tends to be in that department. I come to the board with my board pack and I get judged, and usually I get found wanted. And I have to dig myself out of a hole at every board meeting from people who are, somehow disappointed with my performance. It's extremely easy for founders to fall into that mindset because of the power relationship that I talked about. So if you're an investor, now, by the way, this is, in a way, it's completely misplaced. And it's misplaced for the following reason, which is, as an investor, you've already put money in. So you're in the company. Your only objective now, theoretically, should be, well, how do I build it? How do I build a successful company that I can exit? Because that's our job, fundamentally, put money in, build a business, exit it in some shape or other after a period of time. So the reality is really quite different, which is, where the investors really theoretically should be in wanting to find solutions. The problem, so if you're a venture capitalist, part of the problem with the behavior of VCs is that, well, there's multiple, but one is they don't really have accountability loops. So, for example, if you don't read the board pack before you come to the board, the founder is not going to fire you. If the quality of your advice is poor, well, the founder's probably not going to tell you because he might need your money at the next round. So he's going to be nervous about insulting you. If you're a terrible investor, you probably won't find out for the next 10 years. So in the meantime, everybody's coming and asking you for money. So you think you're important and talented, etc. So you see there's a lot of inbuilt asymmetry that conspires to make you think as an investor, you're more important than you are. Whereas in reality, the reality of the situation, you're simply in the room watching a team operate. So if you go back to your fundamental question for you as an investor, it's like, how do I contribute to the success of my company? Well, the primary answer is, I need to help my founder make better decisions, right? So if the founder's number one job is to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, your number one job is to improve the quality of that decision making. And everything else is kind of decor. So before I deep dive into how you can create, nurture, and generate good boards, I can also look maybe a little bit deeper into some of the dysfunctions that we're seeing inside boards and kind of where they come from. So in some cases, boards lose confidence and simply want to get rid of the CEO. What I find very often is this is not expressed in the sense that VC investors know that they shouldn't get rid of a founder 95% of the time, because getting a founder out is incredibly disruptive to a company. You lose the magic of the original founder vision. It's very hard to do. But when investors start losing confidence, they kind of half in, half out. So they're not fully backing the CEO. They're starting to grumble about the fact that maybe they're the wrong person running the company, but it's not quite expressed. So you have this kind of underlying level of threat that is destroying. First of all, takes the fun out of building a company, which is hard enough for a startup founder. But secondly, kind of quickly undermines confidence. You have a second issue that's extremely common, which is board members aren't aligned on strategy. And it's a difficult one for the founders to solve because you might have an early investor that has slightly different objective from a later stage investor. You might have an early investor that has the history of the company and understand better what it's able to do, and a later stage investor who's promised to their own partnership that a certain startup was going to perform according to a certain plan. And as we know, startup plans are poetry and kind of get missed most of the time. You will also find people who have conflicts of interest. So a fund might be prioritizing, an investor might be prioritizing the objectives of the fund rather than what's best for the company. That happens quite regularly. And again, it's difficult for the founders to manage. Or you might have some simple things like, hey, the board's too big. So what happens typically with big boards is, you start having this kind of showboating mentality happen, which is everybody wants to count. They want their voice to be heard. They want to be the smartest person in the room. So they want to say smart things, which may or may not be relevant to the direction of the meeting. So you get some showboating, what I would call the kind of smartest person in the room syndrome. You also get something that's particularly damaging, which is investors who think they know and who start being prescriptive. So if you think about it, when you come to a board meeting of a company once a month, the likelihood that you have all the information required to make smart decisions is pretty low. So for you to come in and be prescriptive about what a company should or shouldn't do is pretty ballsy. Yet I find that 60, 70, 80% of the time, that's exactly what investors come in and do. They say, you should do this, you should do that. So they're not trying to help you think better. They're coming in with what they think are ready-made solutions based on company X or what they read in the paper that week. You also find that, people, you kind of sort of get a death by overflow. Which is everybody wants to contribute. There's too much conflicting advice. Everybody needs to have an opinion about everything, and the founder ends up with what you might call mentor whiplash, which is he's getting bombarded by opinions, and again, nobody's kind of helping him think about making the right decisions in the right way. Another problem with boards is lack of diversity of viewpoints, which is very often you end up with, you know, a bunch of investors who look like me and who tend to think the same way. So people with overly financial outlooks on life, people who look at businesses through the lens of reporting rather than the reality of the company. And so this kind of lack of diversity in thinking is also something that's quite hurtful. And very often as well, we see that you know, there's a phenomenon of kind of death by reporting. One of the easy things to do that everybody can agree on is to go to the board and receive what I would call the weather report. So the weather report would be, well, what was the weather like last month? You know, was it raining? Was it sunny? In other words, did we hit our numbers? What were our KPIs? You know, and how did we do against what we said we're going to do? It feels very natural, but if you think about it, to spend the valuable time of a founder and their investors in the room together looking at the weather reports from last month, it's probably the worst use of time, because frankly, you can just read that on a piece of paper. So these, I would say, are some of the dysfunctions that you will see and that kind of threaten the good functioning of a board and kind of build up on insecurity on the part of a CEO and can very easily end up in a vicious circle. So I'm going to take a question that was asked to me by Diana. You said, well, who's responsible for managing the board? Is the board responsible for the board? So that's it's actually a pretty good question. I think here's the answer, and I picked up the question now because it's a nice segue into the next section. The powerful founders who've done companies before understand that the board actually is not a reporting body. The board is a decision-making body, and the primary function of the board is actually to help the founder and the management team make better decisions. And so the more experienced founders will come and they will have absolutely zero respect for all the behavior that I just presented, and will say, I want my board to be a working forum where I will come with the key issues facing the company today, or the key decisions that need to be made, and I will use the brain trust around the table to make those decisions. So I would say that the primary responsibility for managing the board at the end of the day is with the founder. However, the more sophisticated the investors can be about understanding the dynamics of a board and contributing positively to the dynamics of a board, the more they help the founder create an environment in which this stuff just simply goes away. So I'll give you one example. I very often find myself what I would call keeping the peace. So in other words, I'll go around the table. Imagine we're in a slightly later stage company. There are 4 investors around the table, and you know, they're constantly, maybe they don't fully understand the strategy, but for whatever reason, there's always slightly uneasy about the direction the company's taking. So one of the things I will do is I'll organize investor calls without the founder in the room, and I'll say, hey, why don't we lay down the strategy together and then see what we agree on, what we don't agree on. And you know, that effectively, that discussion allows us as a group to kind of create alignment around strategy. And then usually I'll work in fairly close contact with the founder to say, hey, I'm going to help you understand if you have misalignment with your investors, exactly where it comes from, and also help you achieve alignment if there's stuff that they don't understand. So it's effectively kind of providing air cover so that the founder doesn't have to do all that work by themselves, right? So that you're kind of facilitating that. In a more mature company, at the end of the day, the role of the management of the board and that responsibility is with the chairman. You know, in early stage companies, having a chairman is kind of a waste of time. We don't need that level of formalism. And de facto, the founder CEO plays the role of chairman, which is what I'm saying is responsible for the board. As you grow and you get bigger and the companies get more mature, having experienced chairman who can kind of help actually the founder focus on the key decisions and the key action points, and they manage the process, can be quite helpful. But it's not something I'd recommend early on in the life of the company. I think it's very often overkill. So you basically go back to the fundamentals and you say, okay, what are the things? Now let's focus on how we make a board really work for startups. So startups, what do startups care about? What do they need? They need high quality decision-making. They need it fast, right? So they need lightness, they need quality of engagement, and they need velocity. If you're playing a role whereby you're making a company heavier, slower, and degrading the quality of its decision-making, you're not producing value, right? So you kind of have to go back to the fundamentals and you say, what's important? What has impact? What do we fundamentally care about? And that will help you decide and understand what should be in the boardroom and what should not be in the boardroom. And I think for the fundamental here, the fundamental question is, are you able, sorry guys, by the way, what are you seeing as the highlighted picture? Are you seeing Julia or are you seeing my face? If somebody could answer that for me in the chat, that would be cool. Okay, we're seeing me. Okay, super. Sorry, I'm just seeing Julia. So the basic building block of a great board is a word called trust. If you're able to create a trust environment, and like a real trust environment, you're setting the foundation for having fantastic board meetings. And the same is true, by the way, for a venture partnership. If you think about the fundamental building block of a venture partnership, just like a personal relationship in your own life, it's always trust. If you have a fabric of trust that you create and that you maintain, you're able to have all the hard discussions that you want to have. So to create trust, you need to create an environment where it's okay to not know, to fail, to be wrong, right? So your mindset as a venture capitalist should be, I've written a check. In all likelihood, I'm going to lose my money because that's what happens very often, or at least not in all likelihood, but there's a decent possibility I'm going to lose my money, and that's life. So the first thing to do is you get rid of your own fear and your own expectations, and you go back to the reality of the field. So if you're able to anticipate failure as a possible outcome, you can kind of relax, and then you go back in the room and you say, okay, I've invested in a startup. It's going to be chaos. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be unpredictable. And now my role, as I said before, is to power great decision-making. And to power great decision-making, the first thing I need is good information. And to get good information, the first thing I need is trust, right? Because without trust, I'm not going to get transparency. I'm not going to get radical transparency. And hence, I'm unlikely to get the information I need, whatever shape it takes, in order to either make decisions or to facilitate decision-making. So you want to start with that. And to do that, you have to give your founder permission to fail, permission to be imperfect, permission to fuck up, right? And your objective actually is to come into a room when the founder feels like they can come and they say, hey, we screwed up on product delivery, we're going to be 4 months late, right? You don't get angry, you don't get upset. What you do is you say, okay, what's root cause analysis? What's going on? Why are we missing our numbers? Are we missing our targets? Are we missing our timeline? You have to take your ego out of the room, and you have to go back to a place where you're able to analyze. You grab information. Information is more valuable than opinions. Your own opinion doesn't matter that much, actually. Your opinion's only mildly valuable. What's more interesting is, can you provide a framework for thinking that's solutions oriented, so that your founder will be better able to get themselves out of the hole that they're in, to focus on finding the solution, to focus on fixing what's wrong. And so your mindset actually is to come in assuming your own ignorance. So you have to kind of let go of what you think you know. You have to look at the reality of a company afresh, and you have to empower a founder to come up with the really bad news, the difficult stuff, the complicated issues. And I think that's, in a way, that's a precondition under which you can start to create conditions for success. So I want to take you through a little bit of just a few examples I'll put a slide up for a second just so you kind of get a visual here. It's not particularly powerful, but it will at least we'll talk about some people. So let me talk about some very high performance boards, and hopefully you're seeing my slides here, that I've worked with. So first, the guy on the left is Alex Chesterman. So Alex has a very particular style around running boards. Alex knows, so here's what we did for Zoopla. First of all, we designed our set of KPIs early on. So KPIs meaning our reporting metrics, etc. Him and I actually spent a fair bit of time outside of the board forum to design a set of KPIs that was perfect, stable, reliable, where we all understood the language. There were 2 Excel spreadsheets. We used the same 2 Excel spreadsheets for basically 6 years. I think we modified a couple of lines over time, but they stayed perfectly stable. Like I said, the definitions were understood. That was our reporting pack. Now, the good news is we trained ourselves and other board members on the reporting pack, and we always use the same. So what did we manage to do very, very quickly? Well, the reporting pack would go out ahead of time, and we would spend literally 5 minutes highlighting a few numbers, or he would spend 5 minutes highlighting a few numbers and then saying, do you have any questions? So now magically and wonderfully, we get reporting out of the board meeting, right? Number 1. Number 2, Alex would do CEO highlights, but again, he would probably spend 15 minutes on it. He would go, here's the things, here's the breakthrough moments, here's the things we did well, blah, blah, blah. And then he'd go, okay, here's the 3 or 4 things I'm worried about. And that would probably take about 15 minutes. Then in his case, we would have a set of decisions that, where either he wanted input or that required board approval. In the case of Alex, he would never ever come with something that wasn't a, hey, I'm looking to acquire X, here's the details of the deal, I'm looking for approval. Or he would come with, hey, I want to invest more in brand, I'm not 100% sure I should do it, here are the trade-offs in terms of cash, here's my recommendation. Alex would never come asking the board what to do. And in fact, this is a real mistake that happens in most startup companies, which is startup founders come to the board to ask permission on strategy and stuff like that, and which is completely the wrong mindset. Only they know what's right for the company. Only they have the information to make the right decisions. And so what they need to come back to a board with is to say, okay, here's a couple of issues I'm struggling in, and I don't know what to do, help me think about it. Or here's a couple of key decisions I need to make. I want you to challenge me on them. And fundamentally, I want to come to a decision with you so that by the end of this meeting, I have an approval from my board on how to move forward. Fundamentally, that's what you're trying to get to. The beauty of Alex was the insane speed of decision-making that he ran at. So part of the reason why Zoopla and Kazoo are so successful is because of the speed at which this guy can make decisions is unbelievable. And he would make them in real time, all the time. And as a result, he created a kind of cadence in the business that was phenomenal. Again, if the board can contribute to that cadence, you're doing well. Will Shu at Deliveroo was sort of a different animal. Will Shu would come in and he'd go, shit, here's a bunch of stuff that's not working. He'd come in his shorts, he'd come from like lifting weights, and he'd come and sit down and be like, guys, we have a problem. Here's 3 or 4 things that are really not working, and I need to fix them, and I need your help in thinking about how to fix them. So the beauty of Will was he really didn't care what you thought. He just came with the problems and presented them with this absolute transparency, and we just focused on every board was like a working session on fixing something or again, making a decision. But the level of candor that he brought, because he had the self-confidence to do it, but the level of candor that he brought to the table meant that we always had highly productive, high quality discussions as a board because the tone was set. Now, most founders are not Will Shu. So again, your job as a board member is to help them feel more like Will Shu. Again, to have permission to be that person who comes out and says, hey, I'm struggling with X. And it could be anything. They're fighting with their co-founder. They made a mistake hiring the head of sales. They haven't figured out the positioning and the marketing and the pricing, whatever it is. They need to be able to come and I should give you the information. And then you need to receive it in a way that's responsible. You know, this is not an excuse for you to get upset and decide that you don't want to back your founder anymore. This is a time where your fear, your anger, your nervousness vis-a-vis your partnership because the investment's underperforming have no place in the room. And, you know, which is why, by the way, if you want to be a great board member, you need to do work on yourself so that you're like emotionally centered, you're not panicky, you're not fearful, you have the courage of your convictions and all that stuff. A lot of board members are terrible because their ego, they're not aware of their own ego and how they're projecting, right? So I'll give you one example. You could be listening, you're involved in a conversation, but instead of listening to what's really happening in the room in that moment and where the debate is at, there's something you've been wanting to say that's running through your brain. And so you're not listening, and then you drop a point that's irrelevant. Okay, so that's an example of being somewhat disruptive. Another thing could be you have a system of beliefs that comes from your background, your own experience, other companies you've worked with, and that system of belief is such that you're not able to call yourself into question when presented with new evidence, which could be the market's changed, the company you're dealing with is different, it's got different human capabilities, etc., and you're just not able to call yourself into question. All that stuff is you impacting the quality of the discussion in a way that's not helpful to the founder. Third example was PillPack. So PillPack, I'll just use as an example of when a board can make a real difference and, you know, kind of breakthrough moments. So we had one breakthrough moment at PillPack where PillPack is an online pharmacy with kind of complex service because we were de facto, we were packaging meds a month in advance in independent packets according to time of day. So it's very complicated. It's like robots that do pick and pack in the background, and you can't afford to make mistakes because in pharmacy you might kill someone if you make a mistake. So it's a really complicated business to run. And because it's a complicated business to run and it's a trust sale, the founder of PillPack always thought it should be a subscription-based business, right? So we used to charge $20 a month, and the whole idea was that, you know, this would give people a feeling of confidence that this was a high-quality, quote-unquote, expensive service. And on top of that, you know, our margins were such that we weren't going to make money for quite a long time. And I remember having, and again, it's the kind of board where there were no sacred cows, right? So I remember having a very engaged discussion with David Franco at Founder Collective and myself, and where I started pushing into TJ and Elliot, and I was adamant that they should go free. And, you know, it's like, look, I think people, you have to sell a trust service, you have to sell a quality service, but you can't do that through money because it's in the US, healthcare is expensive enough. And, you know, you got to find a way to express this through your brand and your product, not through your pricing. I think pricing is the wrong place to go. I think price elasticity is going to be awful. And then the next question was, well, that's fine, Fred, but do you feel confident that we can do that? Because it's going to degrade our margin. We're going to start losing money on every one of our patients. Like, how is that a responsible thing for a board member to say? And again, they didn't hesitate to call me into question. So to kind of come and challenge me in my own beliefs so that this discussion was really valid. And then we kind of thought about it and we're like, well, look, we have a 3-year improvement curve on the margins that will actually make this highly profitable over time whilst being free. And I would much rather have high velocity on the adoption side. And I think we can go sell that story outside to the capital market. And so it was probably a 4-hour debate. And, you know, with me, for example, being quite forceful actually, but because we were in a relationship of trust, you know, being forceful didn't mean you were an asshole. It just meant like I was challenging because I felt in my gut that we should do this. So we ended up moving to free. And I don't remember exactly, you know, how the discussion went, but we ended up moving to free, which was one of the best decisions the company made, right? So it's not to blow my own trumpet, but, you know, on occasion you do contribute something. But that was an example of a very engaged board meeting. I think there was a lot of heat in the room, but it was done with so much respect and so much thinking that, at no point did it become any form of confrontation. It was people thinking together through an outcome. And I think in this case, that's really what kind of made the difference, right? And this mindset that we said at the beginning actually carried us all the way through to the exit, and to the point where it was interesting when later stage board members came, because we ended up raising quite a bit of money for the company. So when we raised a Series C, for example, George Zachary from CRV, it was a 50 million round, and he came in, and George is a very wise guy, and he's very relaxed about himself, and he just looked at the board dynamics, and he's like, Fred, you and David have this in hand with the founders, with TJ and Elliot. Like, I actually don't need to contribute this much. I'm just going to let you guys run this. And so he came to the board. He was an interesting participant, but he kind of let us run it because we had created these conditions where, as a decision-making engine, we were really, really good, right? And we were in flow and we were fast. And I think when you achieve that, I think TJ would say, my board helped me build a better company, because there's 3 or 4 of these, you don't deliver impact every day, but there's 3 or 4 of these foundational moments when, things shifted. There's another example where we started building what we call the pharmacy operating system, which was another one of those that came out of a board discussion that fundamentally changed the direction of the company. So these high velocity boards are really, really transformational for founders. And I would say, as an investor, if you can get to that level with a founding team, then you're doing well. And as an investor, the primary thing that stands between you and that outcome is you. It's your ego. Is you feeling like you have to say things for the sake of saying things? Is you being fearful? It's you feeling like you're more important because you're the one with the money, or whatever it is. It's always you. Defeat starts from within, right? So this kind of abstracting your ego so that you can contribute, and then powering your founder and the founding team to make the best possible decisions. That's what startup boards need, right? So if I go back to the fundamentals of what we talked about before, you have these, broadly speaking, you can think of 3 categories that the board has to fulfill. One is reporting, how much money do we have? How did we do? How are the numbers? One is strategy. And the third one I would say is leadership, right? So it's kind of either assessing how the management team is doing, or coaching the management team, or helping the management team grow, right? These are the 3 characteristics. The one that does not matter in startups is reporting. I would say, like, get it out of the room. In some of my companies, we've actually taken reporting completely off the table. It's like we do a quarterly reporting call. We distribute the numbers every month. If you want reporting, that's not the board. That's like a reporting call, and you can talk about the numbers all you want with the CFO. It's designed for that. And now in the room, it allows us to focus, to effectively have working session around the key strategic topics, right? Around the things that really matter, the decisions that need to get made. And then what we also do is some leadership development, because the board remains a unique environment where, again, in an environment of trust, you can provide feedback to your leader collectively. How you help them grow as a leader, how you help them avoid mistakes, how you help them make hard decisions often as well, right? But sometimes they need to let people go. They're not necessarily ready to do that. I've got another, thank you, Diana. Actually, Diana, do you want to speak? Do you want to ask your question live, since you're, let me see if I can bring you up, if you're comfortable doing it. I've now allowed you to talk. So if you want to ask your question live, that might be more fun.
Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Oh, you can't see me. Anyway.
No, you're not, we can't see you, unfortunately. But
okay, that's fine. Also, I just wanted to know if there's a maximum number of people a board can contain. Because obviously, for example, if you have a startup and they're raising Series A, Series B, Series Cs with multiple investors, I assume that there would be an investor from different funds that want to come on the board. So how big can that board get? And how, I would just think that would possibly become a bit chaotic if there's loads of people. So is there a cap?
Yeah, so board bloat is a real issue. So my recommendation is always to start really as low as you can. So very often in pre-seeds, we might actually run without anybody on the board except the founders. That's the extreme version. Or you might have one investor rep. So you might have a board that has, say, 3 people, for example, both founders and one investor, or sometimes even just a founder and someone else. It could be an angel or somebody like that. When we get to Series A, and typically you land with 5, right? That's normally you're going to have a couple of founders, one non-exec, and a couple of investors. And almost like you want to move as slowly as you can towards that number. In a way, 5 is the magic number. I think for me, with a company that has any form of scale, you know, if you were able to always limit boards to 5 people, that's probably perfect. You know, it's not easy to do, but that's sort of the magic number. Then you start running into trouble because you're going through your B or C, and board bloat starts. So what I always recommend to founders is actually from the very, very beginning is to have some pretty precise rules about, say, for example, ownership thresholds, at which point you lose your board seat. So because it's really painful and really counterproductive to too many people in the room. So, you know, we in France, for example, it's like a disease. French investors never want to leave the board, especially if a company is doing well. It's like they consider, I don't know, it's kind of ego related or something. And so you sometimes end up with like 4, 5, 6 VCs on the board, and it's awful. In Spain, so we were just doing an investment in Spain where it's like it's a seed round. I mean, it's a big seed round, but whatever. But they've already got 6 people on the board, because what happens in Spain is they're like, oh, we're gonna get some gray hair, quote unquote, which gray hair most of the time is not that useful because it tends to be like they get people because of pedigree or, you know, their title or something, but they're not necessarily great board members for a startup. And then a couple of the angels want to be on the board, and then they want another founder who's built a company in the same space, and then an investor, and you come in and there's already like 6 people on the board, and you're like, Jesus Christ. So it's really painful. And I think it's a process that you want to pay attention to. And then as an investor, again, if you're looking at what's best for the company, and this is where, again, your ego has no place in the room, but I just went through a process recently where I told the founder that I was okay being the bad guy to help kick investors off, basically. And so I think it's, for my money, it's okay to go talk to an incoming investor and to tell them, hey, you know, I'm trying to limit my board size, and, you know, it's kind of easier to put this in a term sheet, because I can go to people and say, look, I don't like big boards. It's like nothing personal. It's not about you, but I just want to keep the board size tight. And so that, you know, I played that role recently. I mean, it does piss people off. So, you know, it's like sometimes there might be some collateral damage for yourself. But, you know, it's the right thing to do for the business. So then at the end of the day, I'm all about the founder. So I'll just go and kind of take the hit on it. Because it's very difficult for the founders to do, you know, then it's difficult for the people who are getting kicked off the boat to not take it personally somehow. So there's tension there. But yeah, look, it's an ongoing battle to avoid board creep. The other thing that I find unhelpful most of the time is board observers. So you think a board observer is nothing. You're like, oh, board observer, you know, I can give that like a freebie. But the reality is you now have another person in the room. If they're silent, it's not great because you have a silent person. So de facto, it becomes a bit performative. You're kind of performing in front of a crowd, effectively. That's not really in the discussion. And if they're vocal, it's not great either, because you de facto got a board member that you thought wasn't a board member. So it's kind of a lose-lose. So the other thing that I try and avoid is have too many observers in the room. At the end of the day, you know, small, focused decision-making bodies are best. And the same is true for a venture partnership, by the way, which is, you know, when I was at Accel, we were constantly struggling with this, hey, we want to be inclusive and have as many people in the room as possible. But at the end of the day, if there's like 14 of us around the table, again, it became performative. So we ended up having these deal flow meetings But then for the IC, at the end of the day, we just bit the bullet and we said, you know, IC is partners only. And we know it sucked for the associates, etc. And we felt bad about it, but the dynamics just weren't there, you know, like it was just different. It was kind of diluted. And I think the same is true for board meetings. So yeah, no easy answer to that one. I would say set the conditions in the legal docs and in the expectations from the beginning that, you know, both seats will go. The other thing with independents in particular that I always recommend is do annual running contracts. So I think it's perfectly cool to go to a non-executive director and to say, I will take you on for 12 months. And then at the end of 12 months, we should sit down and see whether it worked for you, whether it's still something you want to do going forward, whether it worked for us, right? And what we're going to try to do together for the next year. So you're almost creating an expectation to say, look, it's not because I'm putting you on the board that you're going to be on the board for 5 years. This is an annual thing. And at some point I may want someone else just to bring in, like I said, diverse viewpoints or somebody who's fresh or whatever it may be. So I think it's a great question and it's not easy. It's not an easy solve for sure.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Let's have more questions. Q&A, hang on, there's some that have come in. Okay, Bola, can I give you the mic? Because that I think is a great question. Let me see if I can find you. Okay, boom. So Bola, go ahead and ask your question live, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're on.
I don't think I can't switch on the camera, I'm afraid, but I can use that as a question. So I guess the question is, obviously when you started off in your career, and you know, as a young investor, and you've kind of sat on your first board, when things were going really bad in terms of, you know, startups have explosions all the time. How were you able to, knowing that it was a lot on the line for you as a young investor trying to prove yourself, how were you able to, what practical steps did you take to, you know, manage your psyche and be kind of constructive on the board?
So this is a great question, and I think it applies beyond boards. It applies to difficult situations in general. So the first thing I would say is, if you're in a partnership, say you're working with me, right? And you're part of the partnership and it's your first investment and it starts going sideways. I mean, the first thing to realize is, like, I personally have seen a bunch of investments go sideways, you know, like, and anybody who's been in the venture business for a while has seen a bunch of investments go sideways. So it's not unexpected. And it's something that we are used to dealing with, right? And in fact, if somebody gets angry at you, let's flip this around actually. If all your companies are doing okay, you're probably not taking enough risk, right? Because if you're in the business of managing risk and avoiding blowups, you're probably going to end up with a portfolio that, you know, kind of has low returns, because the reality, especially on the venture side, is you got to take freaking risks, right? And that means, you know, if you want to generate high returns, you got to do things that are risky. There's no free lunch. So the first thing to say is to realize that fuck ups are common and difficult times are common. And so what matters more in this situation is how you react to it. And the same would be true if you're inside a business and you missed your numbers dramatically, right? The same is true for the founder who misses his numbers dramatically, and for you sitting on the board of a company that's going bad. The first step is like, are you being candid and honest about what's going on? So if you go back to your partners and you say, man, you know, company X is really not going well, and as far as I can tell, the root cause is X, Y, Z. And, you know, here's what I'd recommend we do, but I'm really not sure. And, you know, I just wanted to bring it to the group so we can think about it. So from managing it towards your partnership, if you come up with that kind of attitude and you say, you know, screw it up, here's what I think we should do, etc., you're already in a good place. Your tendency, so this is where it gets a bit more subtle, your tendency will be to say, oh, it was a bad investment, we shouldn't give them any more money. That may or may not be the right answer. That might be your fear talking, because the right answer might be, you know, I know the company's struggling, but I think actually there is a pathway through a great outcome. And, you know, I think we should reserve judgment and see whether they can do X, Y, Z. I give you one example, a company Go Cardless, which is one of the best known startups in the UK today, for a while looked like a company going nowhere. And, you know, it would have been easy for board members to start writing it off, going, this is a failure. So this is where you got to be evidence-based and do the work, and the work has to be grounded in evidence, not fear or opinions. So that's step number one. It's like, you know, you come with the bad news, you come with them candidly, and you focus on finding solutions. Vis-a-vis the company, so let me talk about managing fear in general for a second. So if you listen to SWAT teams like elite SEALs team in the American Army, or anybody who's in situations that are where fear is real, they don't eliminate fear. Actually, they completely accept it. And so the way they do it is actually by saying, you know, there is a high likelihood I'm going to die. And what you have to do is meditate upon your own death. This is what the samurai in Japan used to do. They would meditate upon their own death until such time as they were okay with dying. And they had internalized that that was part of life, actually. And then they would go out in the battlefield with their swords, and they'd be so much more efficient because, you know, they were basically very calm in the battlefield. So perversely, I guess, you know, they increase their chances of survival. Now, in a startup, you're not going to die. So what's the worst case scenario? Well, the worst case scenario is company goes bust. The worst case scenario beyond that is that it goes bust, it ends up in the news as going bust, and my name is mentioned, and my partnership reacts very badly, and they fire me. Okay, so that's worst case scenario. That's like a worst case scenario. Is your life over? No. Do you have cancer? No. You know, it's like, okay, you know, so that happened. And then if you kind of go like, well, okay, all these things could happen. All right, so is that the end of the world? It's not actually. And, you know, as you grow older, you realize, hey, you're gonna have a lot of curveballs in your life. This isn't a particularly bad one. So I think you start with fear. It's like you envision the worst outcome, and then you can kind of go like, well, you know, the worst, I can live with the worst outcome. It's okay. Then you kind of get back to a calm place, and you go back in, and you have, like I said, you have to manage your anger, your anxiety, etc. You know, if you feel they're coming, just find a way to leave them at the door, and you go back into a mode where you're like, you know, are there solutions to this? What is the evidence? What is the data that we have? You know, how do we ground ourselves back into an evidence-based world, not an opinions-based world, so that we have the best possible information to make the decisions we need to make? And again, part of the outcome might be that there is no solution. You know, my second investment in venture, my second or first? My first investment in venture is a company called Realize 3D, and we get destroyed by Android. And not only did my first investment go bust pretty quickly, but on top of that, I'm the one who went to sit down with the founder. We had 4 investors in the company, and the other 3 were like, we got to keep going, etc. And I just went to sit down with the founder, and I'm like, Benoit, his name is Benoit, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm quite a creative, strategic person. I'm quite a creative problem solver, and I don't know what to do. I think our strategic issues are so severe that I don't know what to do. And I just told him point blank, and I'm like, you're allowed to lose my money. Like, I'm not going to crucify you to a cross, but I don't know what to do. And, you know, the corollary, by the way, was me telling him, we're not going to put more money in, which was a very hard thing to hear, right? But at some level, it was my job, you know, because it's also my job to tell him, you don't need to spend the next 4 years or 5 years of your life, which is precious, trying to return money to me. Because if it's fucked, it's fucked, you know? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there is work to do on yourself and to deal with fear. And I think the primary step in dealing with fear is to visualize it, to visualize the bad outcomes. And once you've done that, you realize it's never as bad as you think. and then you can kind of, you can let the tension out, and then you get back to work.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Cool. Does anybody else have questions? Let me check the Q&A. Francisco, I'm going to bring you up because I'm not quite sure what your question is, and I want to give you a chance to give me some context around it. Go ahead, Francisco.
Hello, my name is Francisco, and I was just wondering, when you were talking about being good in a board member setting, how did you like upskill or become better at it? Especially when, from my perspective, I don't have a lot of operational experience to draw from. So how can like a young aspiring VC can be good in a boardroom setting?
It's a great question. So I'm not an operator by background. And the reason why I would say that the thing I do best today, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but the thing I'm best at is being a board member, because I love it so much and I spend so much time on it that I think it's my primary skill. But I'm not an operator. And so I think what I did was, first, I became excellent at certain areas. And so I can't even remember what it is today, but let's just make it up, that you could become an expert at go-to-market strategies. You could say, I want to understand absolutely everything about scaling go-to-market channels, measuring them, whether it's consumer or SaaS. I want to be really good on the KPIs, the metrics, the methods, etc. And I'm just going to go be a student of that. And I'm going to do interviews with people. Maybe I'll publish a few blog posts, but I'm just going to choose a superpower. I'm going to choose an area where I'm really fucking good. So step one. And then step two, I'm going to do the work to make sure that I understand the company well in that department. So one of the things I used to do, which I don't do as much today because I don't have as much time, but I miss it. But I used to go in depth inside the companies, and I'd sit down next to people and be like, hey, show me how you manage, for example, your pipeline, and show me the tool and what you measure and how does it work and blah, blah, blah. And I would go and meet members of the team. And, startups aren't rocket science. They're not rocket science, right? Like, you don't need to be a computational physicist to understand how a startup works. So you go in, you do the work, you spend the time, you give it the attention. And I usually would come out with some insights simply from doing the work. And then I would come back and I would respectfully, now what you want to watch, that you're not undermining people inside the company or the CEO, etc. But I would use that to be better informed. Because I think what happens with a lot of board members as well is that they have a very superficial understanding of a company. They think they know, and then they're in a bad position to really provide any form of advice or thinking. So I think, again, if you're young and inexperienced, what you do is you triple down on the work. Another area that founders found very useful is somebody who has real market intelligence, which is kind of easy to do, actually. So say you're an investor in Impala, one of our companies in the hotel space. And one of the things I used to do is I used to be really on top of market evolution. And it wasn't to sound like a smartass, but it was like, hey, I think Booking.com is moving into this space with this partnership and we should watch it. So one of the things you can relatively easily do is do things like bring market intelligence into the room. That could be helpful. So I think it's a question of like choose an angle, like go deep, and then you broaden the skill set over time. And some of the stuff that's harder to do is really personal coaching, right? So some of the things that come last are like, if you have an experienced, high quality founder, and at some point you're gonna take him aside for a minute and say, look, the way you interact with your team is undermining for reasons X, Y, Z. I mean, that kind of stuff, I don't think you do day one. But yeah, I would say choose a superpower, build on that, because then you're adding value in a specific area. And remember, most board members don't add value, that fact, and a lot of board members destroy value. And when I was working with Luciana, who now runs Sequoia Europe, who's phenomenal, when she was quote unquote my number 2 at Deliveroo, I mean, I don't think she was my number 2, she's incredibly talented, but I would be like the board guy. And then she picked up a number of specific topics that she went to work on and found ways to add value to the company, and Will absolutely loved her. And then she learned a lot about the business. So yeah, I think you want to just narrow the scope and be really good at you got to be really good at something. You got to have a reason to be around the table, and you can't be all things to all people. But if you're good at something and you deliver value around something, I think you'll be appreciated, and then you get more and more engaged, and you kind of build it over time. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
Cool. Let me see what else we got. Okay, I think that's all the questions we got. Somebody asked me questions about specific metrics that we use to manage startups, but I think that's a little bit too precise. Oh, there is a question from Mo. Let me bring Mo up to the stage 1 second, because that looked like a pretty good one too. All right, Mo, the floor is yours.
Hey, Fred. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Mo. I can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, it's just a question about how, especially in today's day and age where every VC wants to be founder friendly, but also if you see yourself in a scenario where the founder is no longer the right person to take the business forward, or you believe that the founder is being value destructive, how do you navigate being founder friendly with also trying to, at least in your opinion, propel the company forward?
Yeah, so it's a good question on multiple levels. So the first part of the question is, what does being founder friendly mean, right? And let's just go back to basics here. Founders want to build businesses, and businesses are hard to build. So we shouldn't be confused between a surface level, founder friendly, I'm your cheerleader, and actually being an effective board member that helps you build a better business. So I think for me, it's not founder friendly as much as it is founder empathic or founder respectful. And so here's how I think about it. You want a relationship of trust so you can have real conversations. I said trust, not friendship. You might develop friendship, by the way, but it's not a given. And trust, again, is grounded in this ability to have the real conversations. If that trust goes both ways, you also are authorized, quote unquote, to have hard discussions with the founder. And the founder will understand that your intent is not negative. And because your intent is not negative, they'll be open to that, right? Because they'll say, I understand you're trying to help me build a better company. And understand that means you might sometimes have to tell me things I don't want to hear or things that are not comfortable. Or you also want to do things like you may want to push into the strategy. At the end of the day, you kind of want to be in a place of what I would call disagree and commit, which is if you're backing a founder and they don't agree with you on strategy, so you can have a very engaged discussion with that person and they end up in the same spot saying, I don't agree with you. I think the strategy is X. Most of the time, it is kind of a beautiful thing for an investor to be able to say, I disagree with you, but we had a good discussion and I'm behind you and I understand why you're making the decision. So that's a disagree and commit. And that's back to the point that I said earlier. It's like you fundamentally are backing someone or you're not backing someone. Now, if you then have a founder who you think is being really value destructive, right? So now we're in the scenario where you're either, I'm convinced, rightly or wrongly, but I'm convinced you're the wrong person to run this company. It's not driven by ego. It's driven by a calm, dispassionate analysis. So your step one would be back to the relationship of trust to go sit down and say, hey, I think you're dropping the ball. I think this company is beyond you, or I think managing a team of 150 people is not your core skill. I think it's detracting, actually taking your energy away. I think you need to move out of the CEO seat, and here's why. So your step one would be to go have that honest conversation with the person. If it really doesn't work and you have somebody who you cannot trust, or where you think they're really just being an idiot on strategy, then it's the job of the board to remove that person. And a lot of people will say the ultimate job of the board. Some people go very far and say the only job on the board is to decide who runs the company. Now, I don't think in startups that's true, but at the end of the day, the primordial role of the board is to decide who the CEO is. And if you're really in that environment where it's being value destructive, then it's actually your job to remove the CEO. I'm thankfully very careful with the people that we back, because I think that removing a founder who doesn't quote unquote remove themselves, removing a founder is one of the most damaging things you can do to a startup, and to be used very carefully. But your job, so this is important. Your job is not to be liked, actually. Your job is to assist a team in building a great business. Your job is not to be liked. And I think it's important to understand that. So on occasion, you have to be disagreeable. And this is why, by the way, a lot of VCs who are quote unquote founder friendly tend to follow the following pattern. So they're like the cheerleader, I'm super founder friendly, I'm super supportive, blah, blah, blah. And then actually they're gradually losing trust and faith, but they don't really talk about it. And the moment comes when the company has to be refinanced, and then your founder friendly VC says, oh, I love you, but my partnership doesn't want to back you. As far as I'm concerned, the only thing that matters is the outcome. If the partnership was losing confidence, it was the role of the VC to go and say, hey, we're losing confidence. What do we do about it? Come and talk to my partners, or talk to me, because we need to do things differently. Your job is not to be agreeable. Your job is to help. Being founder friendly means helping founders build a great business. And that also sometimes means looking into zones of personal discomfort in terms of their own leadership. That also means sometimes disagreeing with them on strategy. The thing to remember, though, is you don't freaking run the company. So when people get confused, it's like, hey, you at the end of the day, the founder makes a decision, and the founder runs the business. So whatever decision they're making, if you've had a good discussion, you gotta align. Because that's the point about you're either backing them or you're not backing them. What you can't do is to start to grumble and say, well, I don't agree with the strategy. It's like, look, if you back me, you back me. If you don't back me, fine. But this kind of in between can be quite damaging. And a lot of people end up in that gray zone of like gradual trust destruction, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Thank you.
Welcome. All right, good stuff. How are we doing on timing, by the way? I'm not 100% sure where we are in terms of session timing. Hang on, I'm just checking. Okay, I'm gonna have to run in a second, so I will take a last question if there is one. But otherwise, I will move to a conclusion. So if anybody wants to drop something in Q&A, let me see if I've covered everything. It looks like we've had all the questions, or I've answered all the questions, I think, that came through. So let me maybe close it off here. I think that, so as I said, as an aspiring VC, right, the key thing you have to remember is when you're on a board, you serve a company. So you always serve your fund, sure, but you're working in the best interest of a group of people, which are employees, founders, delivering a service to customers. And your job is to kind of abstract yourself, your own ego, your own fears, so that you can be of service to that community, to help them make the right decisions, to push them on the things you think they're doing wrong, and to kind of empower them to run faster, right? That's your role as a board member. And if you start with that kind of mindset of being of service, you're usually in a good place. And then the other thing you need is courage, because sometimes it's the courage to stand up to your partners. Sometimes it's the courage to be disagreeable to someone, or the courage to make hard decisions. But it's a place where you do need, you're being paid to make decisions, and sometimes you need to make decisions that are hard. And I think that's also a skill that you need to develop so that you can be an effective board member. And on that note, I will thank you so much for listening. I hope this was somewhat entertaining, and wish you guys a super day.
Thanks so much, Fred. We had one more question from Mo on books on psychology, but we can probably like figure that out and send some links later. But thank you so much for joining and for sharing your insights, and thank you everyone for your questions as well. I think that's everything. Like I said, we'll kind of share the recording later on if you want to go back and recover any of the topics. And we ended up kind of just having a discussion rather than the slides, but there will be some slides that will get shared as well if you want to have a look through what's been discussed. I think that's everything. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it and have a super day.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Julia. Bye-bye.